The chamber of the Galactic Council was in chaos. Bright lights flickered across the massive hall, casting eerie shadows on the towering figures of the alien representatives. Their voices, a mix of deep growls and high-pitched clicks, echoed through the room as they argued fiercely. At the center of it all stood a human, a creature so ordinary yet so extraordinary that it had brought the entire galaxy to a standstill. The human, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a calm demeanor, looked out of place among the towering, otherworldly beings. His hands were bound by a glowing energy chain, but he stood tall, unafraid. The council members stared at him with a mix of fear, anger, and curiosity. "Explain yourself," roared the Grand Counselor, a massive creature with scales that shimmered like molten metal. "How is it possible that your species can interact with water without harm? Water is the most toxic substance in the universe." The human sighed, as if he had been expecting this question for a long time. "Water is not toxic to us," he said simply. "It's the source of our life. We drink it. We bathe in it. We even swim in it for fun." The room fell silent. The alien representatives exchanged uneasy glances. To them, water was a deadly poison. A single drop could dissolve their skin, corrode their ships, and destroy entire ecosystems. Yet here was a creature that not only survived contact with water but thrived because of it. The Grand Counselor leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the human. "Do you understand what this means?" he growled. "If what you say is true, your species is an anomaly, a violation of the natural order. You are either a miracle or a threat. And we do not believe in miracles." The human met the Grand Counselor's gaze without flinching. "I understand," he said. "But before you judge us, you need to understand something else. Water is not just a part of our world, it's a part of us. And if you destroy us, you might be destroying the key to your own survival." The room erupted into murmurs. The alien representatives began arguing again, their voices rising in pitch and volume. The human closed his eyes, as if bracing himself for what was to come. Suddenly, the doors of the chamber burst open, and a group of armed guards rushed in. They surrounded the human, their weapons glowing with a dangerous energy. "Take him to the containment cell," ordered the Grand Counselor. "We will decide his fate, and the fate of his species, once we have all the facts." As the guards led the human away, he turned to the council one last time. "You can lock me up," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But you can't ignore the truth forever. Water is the key. And humanity is the lock." The doors slammed shut, leaving the council in stunned silence. The Grand Counselor sat back in his seat, his mind racing. For the first time in centuries, he felt something he had never felt before: doubt. What if the human was right? What if humanity was not a threat but a solution? And what if the galaxy's survival depended on a species they had always considered weak and insignificant? The answers to these questions would change the universe forever. Years before the chaos in the Galactic Council, the human, now a prisoner of the aliens, was just an ordinary scientist living on Earth. His name was not important to him anymore, but his work was everything. He had spent his life studying water, not because it was rare or mysterious, but because it was everywhere. To humans, water was as common as air. But to him, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. It all started on a quiet evening in his small laboratory. The scientist was analyzing samples of water from different parts of the world, oceans, rivers, even rain. He had noticed something strange in his previous experiments. Water, no matter where it came from, had a unique energy signature. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. And it seemed to react to human presence in a way that defied all known science. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, staring at the data on his screen. "Water shouldn't be doing this. It's just water." But it wasn't just water. His experiments showed that when humans came into contact with water, the energy signature spiked. It was as if water recognized them, responded to them. And the more he studied it, the more he realized that this energy was not just a curiosity, it was a key to something much bigger. One night, while working late, he made a breakthrough. He discovered that water contained tiny, microscopic structures that were alive. They weren't bacteria or viruses. They were something else entirely. Something ancient. And they only activated in the presence of humans. "This is impossible," he whispered, his hands trembling as he adjusted the microscope. "Water is alive. And it's connected to us." The discovery consumed him. He spent months studying the structures, trying to understand their purpose. He learned that they were not just alive, they were intelligent. They communicated with each other, forming a vast network that spanned the entire planet. And they had been waiting for humanity to find them. But the more he learned, the more dangerous his work became. Strange things started happening around him. His equipment would malfunction for no reason. His notes would go missing. And then there were the dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams of a distant planet and a civilization that had vanished long ago. One night, he woke up to find a message on his computer. It was written in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow, he understood it. "You are close," it said. "But they are watching. Be careful." He didn't know who they were, but he knew he was running out of time. He had to share his findings with the world before it was too late. But he never got the chance. One evening, as he was preparing to publish his research, the lights in his lab flickered and went out. He heard a low hum, like the sound of a distant engine. Before he could react, a bright light filled the room, and he felt himself being lifted off the ground. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the water in his lab. It was glowing, as if trying to tell him something. When he woke up, he was no longer on Earth. He was in a cold, metallic room, surrounded by creatures he had only seen in his nightmares. And that was when he realized the truth. Water was not just a part of humanity's past. It was the key to their future. The Galactic Council chamber was tense. The alien representatives sat in their designated seats, their towering forms casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was broken only by the occasional hum of the energy chains binding the human scientist. The Grand Counselor stood at the center of the room, his scales shimmering under the bright lights. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room as he addressed the council. "We have a problem," he began, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This human claims that his species is immune to water, a substance that is deadly to every other life form in the galaxy. If this is true, it changes everything. But we must ask ourselves, is humanity a miracle, or are they a threat?" The room erupted into murmurs. Some of the aliens nodded in agreement, while others shook their heads, their expressions dark. "They are a threat," shouted one of the representatives, a tall, insect-like creature with sharp, clicking mandibles. "If humans can interact with water, they could use it as a weapon. They could destroy entire planets. Or they could save them," countered another representative, a graceful being with glowing, translucent skin. "If water is the key to their survival, perhaps it is the key to ours as well. We should not be so quick to judge." The Grand Counselor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he said. "We cannot afford to make a mistake. The fate of the galaxy depends on our decision. But before we decide, we must hear from the human." He turned to the scientist, who stood quietly in the center of the room. The energy chains around his wrists glowed faintly, but he showed no fear. "Speak," the Grand Counselor commanded. "Tell us why we should not destroy your species." The scientist took a deep breath. He knew this was his only chance. "Water is not just a part of our world," he began. "It is a part of us. We drink it, we bathe in it, and it flows through our bodies. But it is more than that. Water is alive. It contains microscopic structures that are intelligent, and they are connected to us in ways we are only beginning to understand. The room fell silent. The alien representatives stared at him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "What are you saying?" asked the Grand Counselor, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm saying that water is not just a resource," the scientist replied. "It is a living network, a network that spans the entire galaxy. And humanity is the only species that can interact with it. If you destroy us, you destroy the key to understanding this network. You destroy the key to your own survival." The room erupted into chaos. The alien representatives began arguing again, their voices rising in pitch and volume. Some agreed with the scientist, while others called for his immediate execution. The Grand Counselor watched the chaos unfold, his mind racing. He had never faced a decision like this before. If the human was telling the truth, humanity could be the galaxy's greatest hope. But if he was lying, they could be its greatest threat. "Silence," he roared, his voice cutting through the noise. "We will not make a decision today. The human will remain in custody while we investigate his claims. But know this, if he is lying, his species will pay the price." The scientist nodded, his expression calm but determined. He knew the council was skeptical, but he also knew he had planted a seed of doubt. And sometimes, that was enough. As the guards led him away, he glanced at the Grand Counselor one last time. "You can lock me up," he said. "But you can't ignore the truth forever. Water is the key. And humanity is the lock." The doors slammed shut, leaving the council in stunned silence. The Grand Counselor sat back in his seat, his mind racing. For the first time in centuries, he felt something he had never felt before: uncertainty. What if the human was right? What if humanity was not a threat but a solution? And what if the galaxy's survival depended on a species they had always considered weak and insignificant? The answers to these questions would change the universe forever. The Galactic Council chamber was silent. The alien representatives sat in their seats, their faces grim. The Grand Counselor stood at the center of the room, his scales dull under the dim lights. For the first time in centuries, the council looked uncertain. "We have reviewed the humans' claims," the Grand Counselor began, his voice heavy with tension. "And we have discovered something troubling. The galaxy is dying." The room erupted into gasps. The alien representatives leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock. "What do you mean, dying?" asked one of the representatives, a tall, bird-like creature with shimmering feathers. "The energy source that powers our civilizations, the one we have relied on for millennia, is running out," the Grand Counselor explained. "And without it, our planets will become uninhabitable. Our species will perish." The room fell silent. The representatives exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. "What does this have to do with the human?" asked another representative, a massive, reptilian creature with glowing eyes. "The energy source is connected to water," the Grand Counselor replied. "Water is not just a deadly substance to us, it is also the key to the energy source. But we cannot interact with it without being destroyed. That is why the human's claims are so important. If his species can interact with water, they might be able to save us." The room erupted into murmurs. The representatives began arguing again, their voices rising in pitch and volume. "We cannot trust them," shouted one of the representatives, a small, insect-like creature with sharp, clicking mandibles. "Humans are primitive. They are dangerous. If we give them access to the energy source, they will use it against us." "But what choice do we have?" countered another representative, a graceful being with glowing, translucent skin. "If we do nothing, we will all die. The human is our only hope." The Grand Counselor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he said. "We cannot afford to argue. The crisis is real, and time is running out. We must decide, do we trust the human, or do we condemn ourselves to extinction?" The room fell silent. The representatives looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Bring the human," the Grand Counselor commanded. A few moments later, the scientist was led into the room. His energy chains had been removed, but he still looked tired and worn. He stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the alien representatives. "The galaxy is dying," the Grand Counselor said, his voice low and urgent. "And you claim that your species can save it. Is this true?" The scientist nodded. "Yes," he said. "But it will not be easy. Water is not just a resource, it is a living network. And humanity is the only species that can interact with it. But to save the galaxy, we will need your help." The room erupted into murmurs. The representatives began arguing again, their voices rising in pitch and volume. "Silence," the Grand Counselor roared. He turned to the scientist, his eyes piercing. "What do you need?" The scientist took a deep breath. "I need access to the energy source," he said. "And I need your trust. If we work together, we can save the galaxy. But if you try to control us or use us, we will all fail." The room fell silent. The representatives looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. The Grand Counselor nodded. "Very well," he said. "We will give you a chance. But know this, if you betray us, your species will pay the price." The scientist nodded. "I understand," he said. "But if we succeed, it will change the universe forever." The Grand Counselor sat back in his seat, his mind racing. For the first time in centuries, he felt something he had never felt before, hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. And in a galaxy on the brink of destruction, it was also the only thing they had left. The scientist stood in the center of the Galactic Council chamber, his heart pounding. The council had agreed to his plan, but he could feel the tension in the room. The alien representatives watched him closely, their expressions a mix of hope and suspicion. "We will give you access to the energy source," the Grand Counselor said, his voice low and measured. "But you must understand, this is a great risk. If you fail, the consequences will be catastrophic." The scientist nodded. "I understand," he said. "But if we succeed, it will change the galaxy forever." The Grand Counselor leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Then prove it," he said. "Show us that humanity is worth trusting." The scientist took a deep breath. He knew this was his only chance. But as he turned to leave the chamber, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The feeling grew stronger as he was led through the corridors of the Council's headquarters. The alien guards were silent, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with tension, and the scientist could feel the weight of their stares. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. The guards didn't answer. They simply led him deeper into the building, their steps quick and purposeful. The scientist's heart began to race. Something was definitely wrong. Finally, they reached a large, metallic door. The guards opened it and motioned for him to enter. The scientist hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. The room was dark and cold, with a single light shining in the center. As the scientist stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. "Welcome," a voice said, echoing through the room. The scientist turned to see a figure step out of the shadows. It was one of the alien representatives, a tall, reptilian creature with glowing eyes. The scientist recognized him immediately. He was one of the Council's most powerful members, and one of its most ruthless. "What is this?" the scientist asked, his voice trembling. The alien smiled, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "This is the end of your little experiment," he said. "You thought you could save the galaxy, but you were wrong. The energy source is too valuable to be left in the hands of a primitive species like yours." The scientist's heart sank. He had been betrayed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice desperate. "The energy source is connected to water. And water is connected to humanity. If you try to control it, you will destroy everything." The alien laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down the scientist's spine. "We don't need your species," he said. "We only need your knowledge. And once we have it, you will be disposed of." The scientist's mind raced. He had to escape. He had to warn the council. But the room was sealed, and the alien was blocking the only exit. "You're making a mistake," the scientist said, his voice calm but firm. "If you destroy humanity, you destroy the key to the energy source. And without it, the galaxy will die." The alien's smile faded. For a moment, he looked uncertain. But then his expression hardened, and he stepped closer to the scientist. "We will take that risk," he said. "Now, tell us everything you know about water." The scientist shook his head. "I won't," he said. The alien's eyes glowed brighter, and he raised a hand. A beam of energy shot out, striking the scientist and sending him crashing to the ground. The pain was excruciating, but the scientist refused to cry out. He knew he had to stay strong. He had to find a way out. As the alien stepped closer, the scientist noticed something strange. The water in the room, a small puddle near the door, was glowing faintly. It was as if it was trying to tell him something. The scientist's heart began to race. He didn't know how, but he knew the water was his only hope. "Last chance," the alien said, his voice cold and menacing. "Tell us what we want to know, or we will take it from you by force." The scientist took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. "You want to know about water," he said, his voice steady. "Then let me show you." With all his strength, he reached out and touched the puddle of water. The room exploded with light. The light was blinding. The scientist shielded his eyes as the room filled with a brilliant, glowing energy. The alien who had betrayed him stumbled back, his glowing eyes wide with shock. "What is this?" the alien hissed, his voice trembling. The scientist didn't answer. He could feel the energy coursing through him, connecting him to the water in a way he had never experienced before. It was as if the water was alive, and it was speaking to him. "You are not alone," a voice whispered in his mind. "We have been waiting for you." The scientist's heart raced. He didn't know where the voice was coming from, but he knew it was real. The water was trying to tell him something important. Before he could react, the door to the room burst open. A group of alien guards rushed in, their weapons drawn. But they stopped in their tracks when they saw the glowing water. "What is happening?" one of the guards asked, his voice filled with fear. The scientist didn't have time to explain. He knew he had to act fast. "Stay back," he shouted, holding up his hands. "The water, it's alive. It's trying to tell us something." The guards hesitated, their weapons wavering. But the alien who had betrayed him stepped forward, his eyes glowing with anger. "Enough," he roared. "Destroy him." The guards raised their weapons, but before they could fire, a voice echoed through the room. "Stop." The scientist turned to see another alien enter the room. This one was different from the others, smaller, with soft, glowing skin and gentle eyes. The scientist recognized her as one of the council's more sympathetic members. "What are you doing?" the reptilian alien snarled. "This human is a threat." "No," the new alien said, her voice calm but firm. "He is the key. And if you harm him, you will doom us all." The reptilian alien hesitated, his expression darkening. But before he could respond, the glowing water surged forward, surrounding the scientist in a protective barrier. The scientist felt a wave of energy wash over him. Images flashed through his mind, images of a distant planet, an ancient civilization, and a great catastrophe that had torn the galaxy apart. "I understand," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Water is not just a resource. It's a memory of the past." The room fell silent. The alien guards lowered their weapons, their expressions filled with confusion and fear. "What are you talking about?" the reptilian alien demanded. The scientist turned to him, his eyes glowing with the same energy as the water. "Long ago, there was a civilization that understood the true nature of water," he said. "They used it to power their world, to connect their people, and to explore the galaxy. But something went wrong. A great disaster destroyed their civilization, and the knowledge of water was lost. But the water remembers. And it has been waiting for someone to unlock its secrets." The reptilian alien stared at him, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "You expect us to believe this?" he snarled. "It's the truth," the scientist said. "And if you destroy me, you will destroy the key to understanding it." The reptilian alien hesitated, his eyes flickering between the scientist and the glowing water. But before he could respond, the sympathetic alien stepped forward. "Enough," she said. "We cannot afford to make another mistake. The galaxy is dying, and this human is our only hope. We must trust him." The reptilian alien glared at her, but he said nothing. Finally, he turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The sympathetic alien turned to the scientist, her eyes filled with compassion. "I am sorry for what has happened," she said. "But you must understand, we are desperate. The galaxy is on the brink of destruction, and we do not know what to do." The scientist nodded. "I understand," he said. "But if we work together, we can save it. But we must act fast." The alien nodded. "What do you need?" The scientist took a deep breath. "I need access to the energy source," he said. "And I need your help to unlock the secrets of the water. But most of all, I need your trust." The alien smiled, her gentle eyes glowing with hope. "You have it," she said. The scientist nodded, his heart filled with determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he was not alone. The water was with him. And so was the galaxy. The scientist stood in the heart of the Galactic Council's energy facility, surrounded by towering machines and glowing conduits. The sympathetic alien, whose name he had learned was Luma, stood by his side. Her soft, glowing skin reflected the light of the energy source, a massive, pulsating core that hummed with power. "This is it," Luma said, her voice filled with awe. "The energy source that powers the galaxy. If your plan works, it could save us all." The scientist nodded, his eyes fixed on the core. He could feel the energy radiating from it, a force so immense it made the air crackle. But he also felt something else, a connection to the water that flowed through the facility, a connection that grew stronger with every passing moment. "We don't have much time," he said. "The betrayers will come for us soon." Luma's expression darkened. "They won't give up easily," she said. "They see you as a threat, and they will do whatever it takes to stop you." The scientist knew she was right. The reptilian alien and his followers were desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. But he also knew he had no choice. The galaxy's survival depended on him. "Let's get started," he said. Together, they began to work. The scientist used his knowledge of water to tap into the energy source, while Luma monitored the systems and kept watch for any signs of trouble. The water in the facility responded to his touch, glowing brighter and flowing faster as it connected with the core. For a moment, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then the alarms went off. The scientist and Luma turned to see the doors of the facility burst open. The reptilian alien and his followers stormed in, their weapons drawn and their eyes filled with rage. "Stop!" the reptilian alien roared. "You will not destroy us." The scientist stepped forward, his hands raised. "I'm not here to destroy you," he said. "I'm here to save us all. But if you interfere, you will doom the galaxy." The reptilian alien sneered. "Lies," he shouted. "You are a threat, and we will eliminate you." Before the scientist could respond, the betrayers opened fire. Beams of energy shot across the room, striking the machines and sending sparks flying. "Get down!" Luma shouted, pulling the scientist behind a console. The scientist's heart raced as he crouched behind the console, the sound of energy blasts echoing in his ears. He knew he had to act fast. "The water," he whispered. "It's our only chance." Luma nodded. "What do you need?" "Distract them," the scientist said. "I'll handle the rest." Luma hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. She stood up and fired a beam of energy at the betrayers, drawing their attention away from the scientist. The scientist took a deep breath and focused on the water. He could feel it all around him, in the pipes, in the air, even in the energy core itself. It was alive, and it was waiting for his command. With all his strength, he reached out and touched the water. The room exploded with light. The water surged forward, surrounding the betrayers in a glowing barrier. They screamed as the energy overwhelmed them, their weapons falling from their hands. The reptilian alien stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. "What is this?" he shouted. "This is the power of water," the scientist said, his voice calm but firm. "And it's the key to saving the galaxy. But if you try to stop me, you will destroy us all." The reptilian alien hesitated, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. But before he could respond, the energy core began to pulse brighter, the hum growing louder. "It's working!" Luma shouted. "The energy source is stabilizing." The scientist felt a wave of relief wash over him. But he knew the fight wasn't over yet. "We need to get out of here," he said. "The core is going to release a massive burst of energy. If we're still here when it does, we won't survive." Luma nodded. "This way." Together, they ran toward the exit, the betrayers still trapped in the glowing barrier. But as they reached the door, the scientist turned back. "What are you doing?" Luma asked, her voice filled with panic. "I can't leave them," the scientist said. "They're still part of the galaxy." With a wave of his hand, he released the barrier. The betrayers collapsed to the ground, their energy drained. "Come on," the scientist shouted. The reptilian alien looked up, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. But then he nodded, and together, they all ran for the exit. As they burst out of the facility, the energy core released a massive burst of light, illuminating the entire planet. The ground shook, and the air filled with a deafening roar. But when the light faded, the galaxy was still standing. The scientist stood on the observation deck of the Galactic Council's headquarters, staring out at the stars. The energy core's burst had stabilized the galaxy's energy source, but the crisis was far from over. The galaxy was still dying, and the only way to save it was to fully unlock the secrets of water. Luma stood beside him, her gentle eyes filled with concern. "What do we do now?" she asked. The scientist took a deep breath. "We need to connect the energy source to the water network," he said. "But to do that, we'll need to work together, humans and aliens alike." Luma nodded. "The Council will never agree to that," she said. "They are too divided, too afraid." "Then we'll have to convince them," the scientist said. "The galaxy's survival depends on it." Together, they made their way to the council chamber. The alien representatives were already gathered, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. The Grand Counselor stood at the center of the room, his scales dull under the dim lights. The energy source is stable, the Grand Counselor said, his voice heavy with tension. But the crisis is not over. We need a permanent solution, and we need it now. The scientist stepped forward, his heart pounding. I have a solution, he said. But it will require trust and cooperation from everyone in this room. The room fell silent. The alien representatives stared at him, their expressions a mix of hope and suspicion. What is your plan? The Grand Counselor asked. The scientist took a deep breath. Water is not just a resource, he said. It is a living network, a network that spans the entire galaxy. And humanity is the only species that can interact with it. But to save the galaxy, we need to connect the energy source to this network. And to do that, we need your help. The room erupted into murmurs. The representatives began arguing again, their voices rising in pitch and volume. Silence, the Grand Counselor roared. He turned to the scientist, his eyes piercing. What do you need? The scientist took a deep breath. I need access to the energy source, he said. And I need your trust. If we work together, we can save the galaxy. But if you try to control us or use us, we will all fail. The room fell silent. The representatives looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. The Grand Counselor nodded. Very well, he said. We will give you a chance. But know this, if you betray us, your species will pay the price. The scientist nodded. I understand, he said. But if we succeed, it will change the universe forever. The Grand Counselor sat back in his seat, his mind racing. For the first time in centuries, he felt something he had never felt before, hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. And in a galaxy on the brink of destruction, it was also the only thing they had left. The galaxy held its breath. The scientist stood at the center of the Galactic Council's energy facility, surrounded by representatives from every species in the galaxy. The air was thick with tension, but also with hope. This was the moment everything had been leading to, the moment that would determine the fate of the universe. Luma stood by his side, her gentle eyes filled with determination. Are you ready? She asked. The scientist nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. Together, they began the final phase of the plan. The scientist used his knowledge of water to connect the energy source to the galaxy's water network, while Luma and the other representatives monitored the systems and provided support. The water in the facility glowed brighter and flowed faster, responding to the scientist's touch as it connected with the core. For a moment, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then the alarms went off. The scientist's heart raced as he turned to see the energy core begin to pulse erratically. The hum grew louder, and the light grew brighter, filling the room with a blinding glow. What's happening? Luma shouted, her voice filled with panic. The connection is unstable, the scientist replied. We need to stabilize it, or the core will overload. The room erupted into chaos. The representatives began shouting, their voices rising in pitch and volume. We're going to die, one of them screamed. No, the scientist shouted. We can still save it. But we need to work together. The room fell silent. The representatives looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. What do we do? The Grand Counselor asked, his voice steady but urgent. The scientist took a deep breath. We need to channel our energy into the core, he said. All of us. Together. The representatives hesitated, but then they nodded. One by one, they stepped forward, placing their hands on the core. The scientist closed his eyes and focused on the water. He could feel it all around him, in the pipes, in the air, even in the energy core itself. It was alive, and it was waiting for his command. With all his strength, he reached out and touched the water. The room exploded with light. The energy core stabilized, the hum growing softer and the light growing dimmer. The water surged forward, connecting the core to the galaxy's water network. For a moment, everything was still. And then the galaxy came alive. The energy source pulsed with a steady, rhythmic glow, its power flowing through the water network and revitalizing the galaxy. The representatives cheered, their voices filled with joy and relief. The scientist collapsed to the ground, exhausted but triumphant. Luma knelt beside him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," she said. "You saved us all." The scientist shook his head. "We did it," he said. "Together." The Grand Counselor stepped forward, his scales shimmering under the light of the core. "You have shown us the power of unity," he said. "And for that, we are forever grateful." The scientist smiled, his heart filled with hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew they had taken the first step toward a brighter future. As he looked out at the stars, he felt a sense of peace. The galaxy was no longer divided. It was united. And in that unity, there was hope.